Hiya there. So I'm going to do another history book review this evening, and this one is going to be, oh my god, it's going to be touch and go and skating on thin ice. So this book review is going to be in regards to the book called The Great Partnership, and The Great Partnership is written by Christian B. Keller. I had this on Audible, so it's roughly about 11 and a half hours listening time, and it's actually read by David DeVries quite ably actually. So this book is called, like I say, The Great Partnership, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and the Fall of the Confederacy. Now, straight out of the boat, I don't want to put this across. I'm not for or against anything at all. I enjoy reading history. I'm not an American, so I haven't got any vested interest whatsoever. I've read around the topic from both sides. I've read mainstream sources. I understand how this is quite a contentious issue at the moment. Well, it always has been really since the end of the Civil War and preceding it as well. But I think it's intellectually dishonest if we are going to come in without an open mind. And really, this is a book, a history review, a book review, in which case they're looking at two highly important historical figures in the modern era. What I would argue as well is that, like I say, having read around the subject, even from incredibly pro-union sources, that a lot of American people, even after the Civil War, Unionists, people who had fought these two men, had said that they were two of the most probably they lost to the culture in which was extinguished. They are two Southern gentlemen, two Christian, and when I say Christian, I mean in the truest sense of the word, devoutly Christian men. And I think this book, what it does well is it crafts the idea, it gives you the idea and the sort of at the time's expectations about what a man was, what a leader was, and what a Christian was. And I think as it sets this out in the book, it's a good start then to actually follow on for the rest of the book, as what happens, which is they both become part of the Army of Northern Virginia, and ultimately their friendship, which forms the bond of as it was at the time, it seemed like an undefeatable partnership before the untimely death of Stonewall Jackson, and ultimately that turned the war more so than any on battlefield decided did. So, I mean, the first couple of questions is what is the book about? Who is Lee and who is Jackson? So Lee comes from a very distinguished family. His father was Thomas Harry Lee, who had served with George Washington in the Revolutionary War. So the family themselves were a distinguished Virginian dynasty type of aristocrats. The Arlington Cemetery now in America is the old Lee family residence before it was taken from them. I should say taken, but it was it was taken, and then later on, I don't know whether they tried to subsidize the family because they buried the war dead of the Union soldiers on the grounds of the Lee plantation. But so Lee is coming from a distinguished family. Definitely within his lifetime is the inheritors, third generation of the American Revolution. Lee had fought for the United States, was one of the most ablest captains, probably the best soldier in the Union before the war and during the war, I would say, and after the war. He had fought against the Mexicans in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, which really, I think, what Lee had said prior to the Civil War and after it, which rings highly true, which was that the American experiment with government was of such delicacy that if it was ever harnessed and the financial power sort of co-opted the government, and industry co-opted that very fragile early democratic way in which they formed the United States, that they would have I think they would have imperialism abroad, is what he would say, and they would have despotism at home. And I think certainly in 2021, when you've got 200 military bases across the world, and you've got the restrictions and you've got a homeland and you've got a homeland security in the United States now. I think that if you had told him that this would be in the year 2021, I don't think he would have. I think he would have said, "I told you so." But there you are. Who was Stonewall Jackson? So Stonewall Jackson, he was a fantastic soldier who came out of the teaching in the Virginia Military Institute, and one of the more capable and one of the more learned and scholarly generals in the army. The man was a very devout Christian and quite a bit of a sort of eccentric as well. He had different notions about one thing or another, held his hand up in the air as sort of balancing the blood out of his body at some point as well, but he was a very, very aggressive commander, and his string of victories would show that as well, particularly the Chancellorsville campaign was absolutely sensational, really, from the point of view of the Confederacy, which really sort of set them on the cusp of hitting deep into the heartland of the North and really dealing a severe psychological blow to the North and to why they were continuing with the war. But anyways, just to give you, for people who are new to the actual topic itself and they've never really read anything with the Confederacy and or anything to do with the South, and we're just told the generalization, particularly in Britain, we're told the generalizations that it was North good, South bad. They wanted slavery to stay, they wanted slavery to end. I think that the level of simplicity really does a disservice to anyone studying history, really. And a lot of Johnny Captain hindsight's coming through there and arguing with this, with the secession papers say this and this says that, and this. I think really what you have to do is you have to look at what they were writing, what people were writing, primary sources at the time, events preceding the Civil War as well. Why the Confederacy? Why did they break away? So, although it's not formally addressed in this book, the Confederacy broke away from the Union for the individual state reasons, but what you will hear is the argument of states' rights, which is effectively that the central government, the federal government, were trying to impose laws or trying to standardize laws across the Union, which were not in concert with the South, particularly around the issue of slavery. You had a huge abolition movement in the North at the time, but I think that whilst we look back, there was a very interesting parallel in that in the War of 1812 and 1814, actually, you had the North New England states looking to secede from the Union. So this is not the first time this had ever been floated in US history. The War of 1812's reason, or the New Englanders' reason during that war, was purely because the federal government had cut off the ability of the New England shipping states to trade with Britain and trade with the continent. Britain at the time was blockaded by the continental system by Napoleon in France. that fell away after Napoleon's defeat in Russia and his subsequent retreat back to France, and he looked, and he was on his way. So effectively, the New England states were they were being choked by their own government, and he was having no materials, and he was having no material benefit on the enemy or deterioration on the enemy because they've just been allowed to trade with the rest of Europe. So the only people really standing there holding the bag were the New England states. So that's where in the Hartford Convention, they were then looking to secede from the Union, ironically, because of the Virginian dynasty of James Madison and James Monroe had put this proposal into being. And then you flash forward then 40 years later, and you've got the southern states then saying, who have been disproportionately taxed on a tariff system where you've got 25 to 28% of the country's population paying around 80% of the tariff, and particularly on the main crop, which was obviously cotton at the time. And cotton, was, southern cotton was one of the primary drivers of the economy. And pretty much, it was even stated that was one of the main targets of the war as well, because the cotton sales didn't stop. Ultimately the recipients of the cotton were the British Empire, who, when the war did kick off, actually sort of looked elsewhere to get their cotton from Egypt as well. But the North, even when they did start to break the back of the Confederacy later on, they still sold the cotton. They sold the contraband. But in terms of the Confederacy and why it was formed, there are multiple reasons why. Ultimately, the processes involved, the nullification processes involved, nothing worked. I think the group of people, the politicians and the general population, in terms of, say, the white population, we just don't know what the black population thought, because ultimately, let's face it, nobody really asked them, was that they wanted to secede from the northern states that they thought they were unjustly imposing, they had a different system of economics, but also imposing unjust taxes on them, unjust tariffs on them as well. There are other reasons as well. I'm quite persuaded by the argument by, there's a fantastic book that I read by Samuel A. Kordash, and that was written pretty much at the time or just after the Civil War, in which he states that the entry into the Union, so the entry into the Union was at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and prior to that you had the Articles of Confederation. After the American Revolution. Now, after the American Revolution, the Articles of Confederation said that the states that enter into unity were precluded from leaving such federated unity later on. Now, this is not what was desired by the two main drivers of the fledgling republic, which was Virginia and New York, and in particular the Constitutional Convention later on, 1787, and where the Constitution was drafted, took out that stipulation which said that any entry into the Union would be then binding thereof after. But obviously this is where the South states that we have not entered into a sort of a death pact with the rest of them, and that similarly to the where you get a lot of the Southern sentiment was that they genuinely believed that they were fighting for the Second American Revolution. You had people who were second generation; their fathers, grandfathers had fought in the Revolution. They genuinely felt that this was the second time that they were defending the honor of people like George Washington and other Southerners, that they had risen against a tyrannical centralized government where you have a monarch or a president at its head. It matters not if you are being imposed upon and your way of life is different to those imposing upon you the demands or bearing upon you, then they felt it was their right to secede. So it happened, but there you go. So that's the preface of Confederacy. Sorry to go on a little bit about that, but I think one of the main points, particularly about the book, which I found quite interesting, was the sort of men of faith aspect of them both. I mean, both of them were very, very deeply religious men, Christian men as well, consulted the scripture quite a lot as well. I think they respected one another an awful lot because of both of their devoutness. They bonded over religion, bonded over shared values, and that sort of southern gentleman aristocratic background as well. So again, you know, these two men were cut very much from a similar cloth. I mean, Lee had other generals. You mean you're talking about people like A.P. Hill, you're talking about James Longstreet, P.T. Beauregard, Braxton Bragg. He had a lot of other generals in which he had time for, particularly James Longstreet and Jeb Stuart as well, which one of my favourite sort of characters from the Civil War. But I don't think anybody was as close to him as Stonewall Jackson, and his impact on the Army of Northern Virginia as well, I don't think was as nobody else measured up to it as much as Stonewall Jackson did. He was Lee's right hand, and I think the results of the Civil War and the battles, the initial battles, show that definitely as well. So, I mean, just to give you an idea, the book goes into telling you who these guys are, what they believe in, what maketh the men, and then really showing you the sort of the start of the relationship where Jackson sort of comes in really sort of so at the start. It doesn't really set the world on fire, really. First of all, not like General Sherman, but anyways, he doesn't really set the world on fire too much at the start. He's really underperforms. His timing is off with his army. His communication isn't fantastic at the start, but he does sort of salvage it together in the sense of, he doesn't get cut adrift immediately at the start of the war from the sort of high command of the Confederacy, the Army of Northern Virginia, because of his stature within the Virginia Military Institute and his knowledge. He is sought after for advice. Again, like I say, the sort of the sinews and the interactions with Lee starts to lean on Jackson heavily for advice, companionship, guidance as well, and also support, and really does sort of incorporate Jackson as a mainstay of the army, and he becomes, because of his outstanding work and his the fact that his advice is so good and it is on point, that he does become really an indispensable part of the Army of Northern Virginia as well. So we get to the point where you have a fantastic campaign, the Chancellorsville Campaign, where you've got the North, to set into context, had an absolutely overwhelming superiority in numbers, in munitions, in things such as communications, in train lines, in munitions, in replenishment, in manpower, in absolutely everything. The South was pretty much blockaded. They were obviously staring down the barrel even from the get-go. In terms of the modern way of looking at warfare, there was no way. People have made good sort of points that there was no way that the result was going to be anything other than a readmission to the Union of these states after eventual defeat, military defeat. But what he does do well, and what the Army of Northern Virginia does do well, is they frustrate, and I think that they knew, the Confederate leadership and the Army of Northern Virginia, the military leadership, knew that the way that you break the army of the Northern Army was you break its morale, you inflict defeat upon it when you can, you harass, you use real intimidating tactics, you hit hard, you hit fast, and you make sure that, even when you look at the rotation of generals coming out of the north when you've got people like Burnside and McClellan. The north were really rotating generals out at an unbelievable pace, and arguably probably the best general that they should have left in charge was Meade, who'd actually done a fantastic job against the Army of Northern Virginia. But of course, everyone knows the name Grant now. For effectively using that superior manpower. There's nothing subtle about it. Basically throwing the manpower of the north at the south, and until the point where they just could not sustain, they couldn't replenish, and they had to just sort of accept ground, until there was nothing left but to surrender. But I mean, before we get to that point, I mean, you've got the Chancellorsville Campaign, where it really does, the success of that campaign sets up a conversation between Lee, Jackson, and the Confederate leadership about what do we do in order to secure this war, to secure their independence, and to ensure that the North and Lincoln's government can come to the table for peace or something of that sort, or anything at all, a ceasefire, because the North were doing everything they could to ensure that the other powers, the European powers, did not recognize the Confederacy, mainly the British Empire and France. That they did not recognize, they could not allow a significant military defeat to allow those two nations to recognize the Confederacy. And effectively, after Chancellorsville, there was a conversation about whether they hold where they were, or whether they target in Pennsylvania, they cross the border into the north, and they target, the old sort of French word that they used in the Middle Ages would be like a chevauchée. So you're talking about an excursion of the army deep into enemy territory to destroy communications, destroy munitions, target sort of replenishments and procurement of your enemy, particularly hitting them hard after they've been defeated. They're psychologically on the back foot as well. Although the North were replenishing men far easier than the South. At the end of the war, you had hundreds of thousands of people in the Union Army. You effectively had a mercenary army contained within the Union Army of, tens of thousands of Irish, tens of thousands of Germans. You had recently freed men from the South fighting in Union colours as well then. So you had a massive contingent of the Union Army where they were able to replenish their soldiers, and the South not so much. They had a lower population as it was, and I think the conditions of the war, meaning the munitions, the fact that even things as little as shoes, cartridges, shot, they couldn't replenish. They were having to use captured enemy equipment in most cases as well towards the end of the war in order to keep the war going. But that's just how that was going. So really what they were looking to do was to go into Pennsylvania, hence the Gettysburg campaign where they did cross into the north. But I think that, as the book describes, there were alternative versions of where, you could have, they were discussing whether to have Jackson or Jeb Stuart drive into Maryland to try and see if they could cut off and isolate DC and inflict another psychological damage on the north as well. At the time, to put into context, you've even got what were called the draft riots in New York, where you had several days of rioting, where people were being drafted to fight for the Union, and people were just totally against fighting for it. They didn't believe that after the Emancipation Proclamation, that they should fight for the emancipation of freed slaves. People initially at the start of the war were, for the most part, thinking, well, I want to preserve the Union, I want to preserve the state. psychological damage does get done then when you start seeing hundreds of people, tens of thousands coming back wounded, and really the price of preserving the Union. People started to question, well, do I really want that? And also, let's not forget, is that it wasn't, racism didn't just exist below the Mason-Dixon line. It was certainly above it as well, because you look at even after the war ended with the 13th Amendment, certain states refused to ratify the 13th Amendment. Even after, and it took a Southern president in Johnson, Lincoln's successor, to actually get that through as well. But even the North refused, some of the northern states refused to ratify the 13th Amendment to free the slaves. So, we shouldn't be simplistic about our arguments with this topic. That's why I've gone into so much depth about this particular book. I thought this was really interesting in terms of the military strategy that they were planning, like I said, to go deep into the north. Of course, unfortunately, due to friendly fire, Stonewall Jackson took a bullet, a couple of bullets actually, and had to have his arm amputated. And one of the comments was, I think, from Lee, which was, Jackson may have lost his left arm, but I've lost my right. So I think when that happened, and it was touch and go whether he was going to actually survive that, but unfortunately he did succumb to the injuries, and effectively that took away the quality of the subordinates available to Lee. And more people got to understand about Robert E. Lee as well. There's a reason why most 99.9% of American and Western military strategists hold this man in high esteem. And it's not a simplistic black and white, the man had slaves, whatever. What about every man, what about every general before him in history? They've owned people in some we've got to not look at it and impose our 21st century views on people back in these days. And judge his military record from what it was in the field, and that alone. The guy was easily the best commander in the Civil War. When Jackson died, he was bereft of quality alongside him in order to sort of execute his idea about what was going to bring the South their independence. And there were others who tried to help him. Jeb Stuart, A.P. Hill, the other generals helped, and more importantly, which was James Longstreet. Now, Longstreet, there's been a lot of, after the Civil War, there was a lot of backbiting between Jackson supporters and Longstreet himself, and Longstreet supporters, Lee supporters, and they were all vying for their sort of legacy on the sort of the Mount Rushmore, as it was, of the Confederate sort of the Confederate legacy. So effectively, I think that, because the man died, he does pretty much like JFK as a president. They get a pass and some sort of what if, in terms of Stonewall Jackson, as a comparable to JFK, in that because both men died, they, we revere their legacies a lot more than we do other than if they had lived and say if they had failed, of course. So, and there's a massive what if with that. But unfortunately for Longstreet, whilst he was a superb general, he won amazing battles in his own right and supportedly, ably in his own right. The man was just not Stonewall Jackson. That was it. He was not as good as Stonewall Jackson in certain circumstances. He was better than him in others. Not as good as him when Lee needed him to be Jackson, and that was the end of it. That is just how it was. There are people who blame Longstreet for this, they blame him for that. I don't subscribe to that. It's like when you take a superstar out of a sports team. It doesn't matter whether you try and fill them in with somebody more able than them. They're just not as good. And if you don't have your best, if you don't have your best men to provide what you want, you're not going to get a quality result. And that's what happened here. But I think overall this book does a fantastic job of really describing that friendship, really describing how they formed and really turned that army into an able fighting force other than the ragtag army that really, had they not had men like this, that they would have been, and they would have been squashed within a year, if that. So it does go down to, it's very interesting to read about two people who, you know, because of the, you know, there's a lot of quotes where people say about Robert E. Lee saying, never was there a better soldier who fought for a worse cause than this, words to that effect. But ultimately, you know, you look at what they wrote themselves, you look at what these men believed themselves. You know, Robert E. Lee was offered the command of the United States Army to invade his own home state of Virginia. Now, same as Stonewall Jackson. You know, once the House of Burgesses and the Virginia legislature said, no, we will secede from the Union, that then informed his decision. He would do as his state commanded. You know, ultimately the men stood, yes, and they failed on principle. And certainly, you know, as a parable today, if the roles were reversed and, you know, something comparable happened like that in the United Kingdom, I think that I wouldn't have a second's hesitation of doing something similar myself. And it was just that simple for these two men in their particular circumstances, I must stress as well. So overall, looking at the pricing of the book, I would say it is still a little bit high at the moment. So you're looking at hardcover, £22, paperback was roughly about £13, Kindle, I wouldn't pay that for a Kindle version. I did get it for £8.99 on Audible. This is £8.99's worth. It is fantastic. It's a long book. It's 11 and a half hours, but it's well worth it. And I think who I would say this book is for, I would say this book is for anybody who loves the Civil War. But most importantly, I would hope that whoever would want to come across this book comes across it with an open mind. And when I say an open mind, I don't mean in the sense that you are here to flex your moral standing for a bunch of racist traitors, as some would say, but judging two commanders as they were at the time in a climactic battle, in a climactic war that still has ramifications today, and that similarly to World War II is so thumped into our psyche that it is a black and white option between good and evil, that I think that if you come into this with honesty, that shatters any sort of preconceived comic book style naive views of this conflict that you can have. And I think this book is absolutely superb in telling in the microcosm of this relationship between these two, because the two men were fantastic commanders, and this book's reading was well worth it because of that as well. I would, while I'm here, just to give you some context around it, if you do enjoy reading this topic, and you do enjoy, there's nothing to be ashamed of to reading history, reading defeated parties or anything like that at all, particularly the Confederacy. If you want to read around the topic, then there are some fantastic books as well if you wanted to have a look at. Another one, an Audible book that I've got queued up, is called The Clouds of Glory by Michael Corder, about the life and legend of Robert E. Lee. So this one is a lot more reasonably priced. The book I mentioned earlier, which is a southern view of the invasion of the southern states, that was really, really good. I got that on Kindle for $5.99. This one is more. It takes more of a legal argument, and it does break down, the southern cases for secession, and also the northern reasons why they were debunked, as we would say these days, or why they were completely just over, the southern reasons were just totally disregarded, and subsequently what happened then by the federal government under Lincoln and the Republicans to ride roughshod over what were considered, you know, mainstays of state and federal government sort of interaction prior to the Civil War. The other brilliant book that I've got by S.C. Quinn. Now that guy was on the Joe Rogan podcast. I think he was not the Killers of the Flower Moon. That's it, the Empire of the Summer Moon was that he was promoting on there. But this one's called Rebel Yell: The Violence, the Passion, and the Redemption of Stonewall Jackson, which I've got the hard copy I had for my birthday, so I've got that one to read too. You've got this book on James Longstreet, which I've got queued up, but that's got a lot more expensive, so I'm going to leave that for a few weeks to see if there's any cheaper versions. So in regards to Longstreet, again, another general to read on the topic of the Confederacy. And lastly would be this book, which I've read this book already online, but I want to get the hard copy of it. It is very tough to get. It is called When in the Course of Human Events, and it is another document in the case for Southern Secession. So, like I said, none of what I've reviewed, although you may think is slanted one way or another, I'm a British person. I love history, and I love reading around the topic. I like to find out as much information as I can about the topic. Doesn't mean one way or another I couldn't care less. This event has happened 150 years or whatever it was before I was born. Ultimately, these are fantastic sources to read around the topic and to inform yourself, and that is the most important thing when you deal with really topics which are really black or white, or there's a massive hot button topic in culture at the time, whether it could be the transatlantic slave trade, World War II, the Holocaust, anything at all like that. The more information you get, read around the topic, and that will inform your opinion. Also, and hopefully we can all be intellectually honest and say, listen, it's happened, it's done, but let's inform ourselves about the best evidence that we have for it, and then we can all obviously make sure that we know then what is good history and what isn't. But overall, just to wrap up now before I go, so just to give a rating for this book, I would give it a 4.5. Sorry, 4 stars out of 5. 4.5 would be too generous. 4 stars out of 5. So going back to it, I would say buy this book, The Great Partnership, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and the Fate of the Confederacy. Of course, I've gone on for a little while now. If you've got a comment at all, pop it in the comments box below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. I've got a lot more videos coming and a lot more reviews as well. If you've got any reviews as well, or you've got any book recommendations, put them in the comments below as well. And if you wouldn't mind, share the video. But I appreciate you listening, if you've listened all the way through to the end, because it does, when you talk about a topic such as this, I feel like you're in front of an inquisition sometimes, where you have to absolve yourself of the suspicion of empathy towards people who were defeated and whatever had any sort of moral hangovers or any sort of things that they did now that we would consider taboo. So I appreciate